I said. The first one is by Joao Paulo Oliveria Costa. He obtained his PhD in history from FCSH Nova University, Lisbon, Portugal. He is professor of history, Department of Nova, Lisbon, and coordinator of the UNESCO chair, the Oceans Heritage. Some of his research projects include the project Concha, the construction of early modern global cities and oceanic networks in the Atlantic, an approach via oceans cultural heritage. So we are on to him. His topic for today is Catholic art in Asia in the 16th century, interaction between India and Japan. So over to you.
So thank you. I hope you are listening me well now.
Yes.
It's a pleasure to be with you again, not in New Delhi as I was in September, but through the internet. So first word to thank you the invitation for participating in this so interesting conference. And to my greetings, particularly to all my friends I met personally a few months ago there in the Indian International Center precisely, which is always a nice place that I see again. It's for your facilities because I visit them since 1989, so and I've been there for several times, always very well welcomed. So my paper deals with a comparison between some forms of art as they were played in India, particularly around Goa, and in Japan, particularly in Nagasaki. It's not, for example, yesterday, my colleague Alexandra Curvelo presented to you which was a direct influence of India to Japan through the Portuguese, because she was talking about the tissues, particularly the cotton tissues that were introduced by the Portuguese in big quantities in Japan. Now, what I'm going to show you is a little bit different, because it's more how two different Asian civilizations, one Hindu, another Shinto and Buddhist, well, with a very syncretic terms of religion, reacted to the same religion that was coming. Of course, that in India there were already Christians since the beginning of the religion, while in Japan there were no kind of knowledge about Christianity. But in both cases, it was the first time that Catholic Church appeared, and that Catholic Church appeared with a maritime network of traders, and in India also of soldiers. So it's a very specific situation, and what we are going to see, it's not how Indians and Japanese interacted or interfered one with the others, but how both reacted to the Portuguese and to the Catholicism that the Portuguese were bringing with them. So I'm going to share now my PowerPoint. I hope you are seeing it already. And now in full screen. So these first two images will help you to start my point. We are on the left. You have the cathedral of Goa, which is a Western building. It is very similar in the facade to several of the cathedrals that were built in Portugal in the same period, the second half of the 16th century. It's the same model. And on your right, taking from the Nambambiombo, the drawing of what was one of the churches of Nagasaki, and it is like a Buddhist temple, but with a cross, because this is a major difference between what was one of the major differences between Goa and Nagasaki. At the same time, it seems because in Goa we are aware that the rulers were Christians and Catholics, but that there was still a Hindu population that kept living there under the rule of the Portuguese and some Muslims. While in Nagasaki, and I will come back to this point, despite to be a Japanese city, it was inhabited until 1614, mostly only by Christians, but I mean baptized people. So the Portuguese arrived to India in 1498, and they arrived to China very soon in 15 years, but then they lasted more 30 years to arrive to Japan. And because Japan was out of all these trading system of the Indian Ocean and the West Pacific, and so even the Portuguese, only when they got some capacity to stay in the Chinese coast, they had possibilities to wait for a new monsoon and then to sail to Japan. Was the ship. This was the ship that then moved. They did this interesting, speaking about India and Japan, because this ship, the Kurofune, as it was called by the Japanese, it means the first direct connection between India and Japan, because this voyage started in Goa and ended in the Japanese shores since 1570 in the ports of Nagasaki. So this was the ship that made the connection and the first direct connection between India and Japan. So this is a view of Goa by the end of the 16th century, drawn by Linschoten, a Dutch traveler who was Catholic and who was even servant of the Archbishop of Goa, and who published the first great report about the Portuguese Estado de India, written not in Portuguese but in Dutch, and then translated into different languages. So Goa was a city with the same appearance of a European or Japanese or a Portuguese city, and we can see by look in the buildings. These kind of buildings, we see different drawings from the Atlantic islands, for Brazil, or even for some Portuguese villages, and the buildings are very similar to these, particularly the roofs, but with a population that was a mixed population of different Asian provinces and European provinces of all these people. Nagasaki, it was a different city. It was it started being built in a Japanese style, in a flat place, and with all these perpendicular streets. This is a panel that is in downtown Nagasaki. I took it from in the street. It is an illustration done by the government of Nagasaki, and then the city grew. So this area here is this Uchimachi, the oldest part of the city, and this is Sotomachi, the outside part, in the 80s or 90s of the 16th century. It is in red because this Uchimachi was the first part which was nationalized by Toyotomi Hideyoshi in 1587, and this in red, it belonged to the Omura daimyo until 1606, and only in 1606 was also nationalized by the Bakufu, so by the shogunate of the Tokugawa. And the environment was of Nagasaki. In Nagasaki, we could see all these people dressed as Portuguese in a movement when in the market. But look to the young people, because I will come back. All the young people are in an Asian look, because all of them, their mothers were Asian women and not European women, because most of these Portuguese came to India where they were single, or they left their women and they married again because they got away to get. So most of the second, third, fourth generation of Portuguese in Asia were people who was already born in Asia, and most of them were children from Asian women. So the arrival of the Portuguese in Nagasaki created curiosity, and it's very interesting because all my images that I'm showing to you are from Nambambiombo. The last one, this one is it is in a museum in Osaka. This one is from Biombo, which is now here in Lisbon. But so this idea of the curiosity, we have this is the best example in my opinion. But we have also here, for example, taken in a bad photo taken in Osaka, and also this one, also again from Lisbon, from the Biombos which are in Lisbon. So we have this curiosity, and all the Portuguese arriving with different gifts that they are offering to the Japanese authorities in the city. As we know, and it was told yesterday, particularly, Christianity arrived to Japan by St. Francis Xavier here in a statue that is in a monument that is in Oita, an ancient Funai, the capital of the Otomo Fief. And so Xavier arrived to Kagoshima, where is there the statues with all the other two auxiliaries that came with Xavier. So he arrived in August 1549, introduced the Christianity, and through the Portuguese were introduced many other ideas, techniques from the West. This is a statue also in Oita, remembering Luís de Almeida, a trader from Macau who was also a medicine and who became a Jesuit later. And here he is remembered here as the introductor of Western medicine in Japan. In Oita, nowadays, there is a Luiz de Almeida Hospital that is a memorial for these achievements and for this introduction. So, the Portuguese were also bringing to Japan some Indian original, not only tissues, but also animals like peacock, which is from India, and now here the Japanese also admire. Don't forget that these Namba Mbyombo are kind of photos. They were painted by Japanese artists without any pressure from the Portuguese who were there. The authorities over the city were always the Japanese themselves. There was a moment between 1580 and 1588 that Omura Sumitada, the daimyo, offered the city to the Jesuits, who officially were ruling it, but through Japanese officers, and never by the Portuguese themselves. Look here, and as I told you, it was a Christian city, which is remembered even nowadays. For example, this is a memorial which is placed in Nagasaki, in the very place where there was first the Misericordia, Misericordia, so the headquarters of the Misericordia. Misericordia is a charity institution that the Portuguese developed since 1498 in Portugal, and which was spread through over all the empire of the Portuguese, as well as in the other places under its influence, as it was in Nagasaki in Japan. And it again, coming to the Namba Mbyombo, again here, so the mass. And look at here to emphasize that what could be coming from India were the objects for the cult, which were also from European influence. But then look, as I told you before, that the church, even with tatami, is a Japanese style building, where the Christians as well as the servants of the priest are in a Japanese position over their knees, and not in the usual European position. So there was an assimilation very clear and stronger in Japan, because Japan was outside. Don't forget, Japan was outside what was the military empire of the Portuguese, in contrast with Goa, which was the headquarters of the Portuguese military presence in Asia, and a city which had been conquered by the Portuguese to Bijapur, the Sultanate of Bijapur, in 1510. So here, more clearly, this and look for the clergy. This is a Japanese, and we'll come back to that, because even in the clergy, but that it happened also in Goa. So Goa and Nagasaki were the two cities of all the missionary world in the 16th century, where more native priests existed. We have a few in Goa reported since the 50s of the 16th century, and there were 14 Japanese priests in 1614 when the Tokugawa issued the ban against the church, and the missionaries were expelled. You can ask me, oh, only 14, but I will answer you, already 14, because except Goa, in the other parts of the world, even of the Spanish influence, there were none, or almost none, and that's very important. For example, in the case of Goa, I'm speaking about the diocesan clergy, because even the Jesuits in Japan in 1590, in 140 Jesuits, 70 were Japanese, while in India only there was one Indian, Brahman. So about this idea of how important was the Christianity in Nagasaki, I published about 25 years ago this book about the annual letters of the College of Macau. And in the College of Macau, since 1594, when it was founded, until 1627. And when in these reports, the Jesuits say that they are baptizing some dozens of adults every year in Macau. But the annual letters of the same Jesuits in Nagasaki in the same years report hundreds of adult baptisms every year. What is the meaning of that? Is meaning that Nagasaki was a growing town, because it was a trade town in the late 16th century and in the beginning of the 17th century. So it means that many people was coming to become inhabitants of the city. And it looks like, we have no evidences in the documentation, but the figures allowed us to believe that most of the people arriving to Nagasaki, it was accepted baptism as a way to be introduced to the sole Christian city of Japan. And this Christian city that was also growing with, it looked like Japanese, because of course the old people, the olders could be Europeans, like in this, look, I insist, this painting was made by a Japanese artist who was not engaged with the Portuguese or with the Portuguese Empire, but he draws the Portuguese as 3 European adults, 2 African slaves, probably, but 2 African, and 3 other people, young and Asian looking like, and all dressed in the same. So this means that these are the Portuguese by the way they are dressed, by the way they have the hats there, they have the crosses and so on, the swords, but at the same time being clear that there is a new generation that is Japanese. It means that most of the people that in our written sources we see the Portuguese arriving to any harbor of Asia, it could look like this young guy and not like this old guy. And so it was, and look, even is the same Japanese who are painting. Look that these Jesuits, this is supposed to be famous and almost legendary Brother Lourenço, who was one of the founders of the mission, and a young Japanese as a brother of the society, maybe later a priest. So now for my part and final part of my presentation, some comparisons of how Indian people and how Japanese people assimilated, but made some nativization of Christianity. Look, this is a church in the territory of Goa, Santana Talaulim. It's a church of the 18th century. It's not from the first, and so it's not so European like the cathedral that I presented in my first slide. Look, these towers are not the European style, and this makes us more remember pagodas. And look like what they have here in a fan. This is a representation of a church, of the Jesuit church in Kyoto, so in Miyako at that time, just before the civil war that took to the death of Oda Nobunaga. Oda Nobunaga was the great warrior. He was who started the reunification, political reunification of Japan since the 60s of the 16th century, and he became a real friend and admirer of the Jesuits, and particularly of one who was Luís Freud. And we know from Freud how Nobunaga was a protector of the church, since that the church also would helping them. Don't forget that in 1578 there was the city of Kuchinotsu, not very far from Kyoto, was besieged by the army of Nobunaga, and the captain of the fortress was a Christian, Takayama Ukon. Instead of attacking the city, Nobunaga called Father Argentino and asked him, please say to your Christian that is in charge of that city that if he comes to my side, I honor him. If he don't come, I ban the church. And Father Argentino was able to convince Takayama Ukon to change of side. And Takayama Ukon then was a servant of Nobunaga, later a general of Hideyoshi, but then he pursued in his faith, and then he was exiled to Manila, and nowadays he's a saint of the church. But so the similarity, this solution in this kind of solution, architectonic solution that we find in India and also in Japan, where we have many towers as Buddhist temples too. And the most interesting for me, theologically speaking, from a religion speaking, is the Christ, how the Christ is represented, because mostly here in Europe, the Christ is representing in the cross, of course, suffering. And we, the Catholics particularly, emphasize very much the Latin Catholicism, so Southern European countries. Here is very common to emphasize the suffering of Christ, and almost the most important moment of our faith is looking to the cross and not to the resurrection of Christ 3 days later. But look the face here. This is a Japanese, this is a European style painting made in Nagasaki by a Japanese. And look the face of the Christ. And he's not suffering. He's just in a kind of enlightenment, like the Buddha. And this is very important because I think this is one of the most important reactions of Asia, not to accept the suffering of God. And so what happens through over Asia, because now I go to Indian ivory and look at it is not in the open eyes, but the same serenity, not so the idea of sufferance. And even coming back to Japan and to the Western style painting school that existed in Nagasaki by the end of the 16th century and beginning of the 17th century, this Christ with well, it was the spines in his head, but it's not dying. So it's, and also how this it was spread. And look, coming to the end, this in this case, this is a Japanese painting with the representation of Our Lady of the Rosary. But we in Europe, we have not this kind of draws and of representations, but in India we have. And one is made in silk, the other is made in ivory, but both with, and look at here, Our Lady Mary here is already in a Japanese looking face. Here in the colonial city of Goa, it was different. But look, the similarity, and I insist, we don't have this kind of images in Europe. So this was an Asian adoption of and reinterpretation of the representation of the Virgin. And it's possible, it's much possible that this image in Japan was, this is maybe here clearly an influence coming from those Christians. Alexandre Courville talked with you about that yesterday, how in the Kurofune, the Greek ship that I showed you in the first of this presentation, a part of the crew were Indian people. I told you when I was there in my lecture of September that one of the first reports of the use of artillery in Japan, it was in the Battle of Okinawate in 1584, when the forces of Satsuma and Harima defeated Ryosuji Takanobu, who was invading the region. And according to Freud, there was some cannons from ships. According to Freud, it was a Portuguese with an African slave and an Indian who were making the fire against the forces of Ryosuji Takanobu. So Indians were coming, and here we have a direct influence. And finally, yes,
summarize your presentation in the next?
I'm finishing. Yes, the last person. This kind of support for the books, release books. So here in Japan on the left, in India on your right. So the appropriation to their own style. So these were my remarks about these, both the reaction, how Indians and Japanese reacted to Catholicism through objects. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for this presentation.